Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Word on Wednesdays. I'm really excited to be able to continue to study the book of 1 Kings with you. And tonight we're going to be in chapters 5 through 7. So I'll give you guys a second to get there. 1 Kings chapters 5 through 7. Now, before we get into the text, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father God, we thank you again for this opportunity to get into your Word, to learn more about you and to grow in our understanding of who you are. I pray, Lord, that you would be with us this evening as we are looking at this text, as we are studying really the building of the first temple. I pray, God, that you would give us understanding, that you would help us to see what it is you want us to see, and that, Lord, as we grow, that we would leave this place changed. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, if you all remember, after being anointed king in chapter 1, Solomon quickly began to deal with any and all problems that could have been a threat to his throne. And then after this, Solomon began to realize that he needed wisdom, right? As looking at the task that was ahead of him, realizing that as the king of all of Israel, it was going to be a huge responsibility. And being a young kid himself, he realized, I need help. And so we found last week that Solomon, instead of asking for riches, instead of asking for honor, instead of asking for prominence and all of this, Solomon instead asked for wisdom. And the Lord gave it to him. He gave him so much wisdom that it is said that he was wiser than any man who had ever lived up until that point and would ever live from then on. Now, we saw this wisdom in dealing with the women who were both fighting over whose baby was still alive. We saw this as he did his administration. We saw his wisdom in his doing philosophy and showing wisdom through other people and how to deal with the various issues. We saw it in his studies of sciences and the philosophy and his writing of Proverbs and the various songs and all of this. Solomon was wise. Now, in addition to being wise in all of these areas, we're also going to see today that he was also wise when it comes to doing the biggest thing that he is going to really be called to do his entire reign, and that is the building of the temple. And that is really the theme of chapters 5 through 7 is Solomon going and having the temple built. Now, if you all remember, up until this point in Israel's history, God's dwelling place was a tent, right? The tabernacle. The Lord had commanded Moses about 475 years earlier to go and to build this tabernacle and to be able to have that be the place where Israel would go to worship. Now, the best thing about the tabernacle, the reason that the Lord wanted it to be a tent was because that meant it was mobile. The people could pack it up and they could move it. They could go wherever it is they needed to go. So during those 40 years in the wilderness, they were able to take the tabernacle with them. And so as they went and set it up, they could still go and worship the Lord. And because they were able to move it around and bring it with them, it was a physical manifestation. It was a physical picture of the Lord's presence, right, that he was among them. Now, after they went into the promised land, we find that they still had a lot of enemies surrounding them. And so because of it, even though that they went into the land where they were supposed to go and even defeated some of the prominent enemies, the fact is they still had issues. They still had threats. And so because of it, we found that they still couldn't be building a temple yet, because it could very well be that they built a temple in one location only to have, say, the Philistines come in and take over all that land, and now they don't have access to their temple anymore. And so instead of allowing that to happen, the Lord just continued to dwell in this tabernacle, this place of meeting. We found this already happen a couple times in the book of 1 Samuel, as the tabernacle was in Shiloh. And while there, we find the Philistines came in, and because the Israelites at the time weren't really seeking to follow the Lord, right, the tabernacle on the city of Shiloh was destroyed. Now, they were able to get the tabernacle out of there before the city was destroyed, but it just showed all the more that there were many threats surrounding it. And so they could not have opportunity, at least up until this point, to build the temple. But see, now is in the time of Solomon. The time, as we talked last week, that was described really by two words, like peace and prosperity. And it is now in this time that the Lord is going to have Solomon go and build this temple for him. And so if you want to break up these three chapters, you find in chapter 5, it is the getting the supplies prepared for the tabernacle. And then in chapter 6, it is the building of the temple. It is the building of the temple. And then finally, we find in chapter 7, in addition to mentioning Solomon's palace, we're then going to see all of the furniture and all that built for the temple as well. So let's just get into it. Let's look at verse 1 of chapter 5. It says, "Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon, because he heard that they had anointed him king in the place of his father. For Hiram had always loved David." Now Hiram was the king of Tyre, really the king of all of the area known as Phoenicia, which was a land just roughly north west of Israel. And it was an area that was, I guess, known as modern-day Lebanon. Now, Tyre was the capital city of it, and it was also a port city. But the thing that was really well known about the city of Tyre, and really the whole area of Phoenicia, it was their lumber. They had great cedars, and the cedar trees were really nice for construction. And the reason they were so good was because of the thickness and everything of the trees, because of the way that they grew, that they were durable. Right? They were resistant to rot and to worms. They were fine-grained. They could be polished really easily and really fine. And these were ideal trees for lumber, which didn't actually exist in Israel. And so we find that David had started his relationship with Hiram all the way back in 2 Samuel chapter 5, when he went, and after they took the city of Jerusalem, David went to build Jerusalem up all the more. And so he went and he met with this guy Hiram in order to get some of the trees. Now, while he was there, a friendship blossomed between the two, and they had really been friends ever since. And so now, after David's death, Hiram hears that his son Solomon had been made a king. And so he goes and he sends these people to essentially come and to try to continue in this good relationship that he had already had with the nation of Israel. Now, as the people get here and basically send their regards, we find then that Solomon begins to request supplies for the temple. And we see this in verses 2 through 6. It says, "Then Solomon said to Hiram, saying, 'You know how my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God, because of the wars which were fought against him on every side, until the Lord put his foes under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor evil occurrence. And behold, I propose to build a house in the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spoke to my father David, saying, Your son, whom I have set on your throne in your place, he shall build the house for my name. Now therefore, command that they cut down cedars for me from Lebanon, and my servants will be with your servants, and I will pay you wages for your servants according to whatever you say, for you know that there is none among us who has skill to cut timber like the Sidonians.'" Now, if you all remember, all the way back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, David was sitting in his palace, and as he was sitting there, he looks out into the courtyard, and there he sees the tabernacle. And while he is sitting there and looking at it, the thought came to him going, it is not fair that I get to live in this beautiful palace while God has to live in a tent. I don't know, you can imagine after 470 something years, right, this tabernacle was probably looking pretty beat up. And he says, this is not okay. So he proposed to then go and to build a temple for the Lord. And while he had a good heart in desiring to do this, we find that the Lord told him no. Now, he told him no really for two reasons. First off, it was because David was a man of war. And the Lord desired that it be a man of peace who would come to build the temple. But in addition to that, we also find that the other reason that the Lord didn't want David to be doing it was simply because the nation of Israel was surrounded by enemies at the time. And as I mentioned earlier, not only was that then a threat to that land, but it also meant that the full focus then couldn't then be on building the temple, because they were always having to focus on, okay, well, do I need to now go to war against Moab? Do I need to fight the Philistines? Do I need to go up against the Syrians? And so because of this, we find that the Lord said, no, I'm not going to let you build the temple, but your son can. Now, upon hearing this, David's response was essentially, well, I'm going to then do everything in my power to help Solomon with this. So he spends really the rest of his rule, the rest of his life, going around and defeating all of the surrounding enemies of Israel. And then in addition to that, going and gathering all the funds, all the money that would be necessary to go and build the temple. Now, in addition to this, we also find that he drew up the blueprints for the temple. He also went and got all the gold and everything that would be needed for this. David got everything he could ready at the time. Now, we're not going to look at it now, but if you all have opportunity, your homework would be read 1 Chronicles chapters 28 and 29. Because in those two chapters, we see just how much detail and how much work David put in to getting the temple ready, even before Solomon took over. And I really like David's heart here, because even though he knew he would never be able to see this happen, right, that he was not allowed to do this work, right, he loved God enough to desire to still do whatever he could to help in this work. Right, I love this picture because often this is the same kind of heart that the Lord begins to put in many of us when it comes to missions. It could very well be that we're never going to be called out into the mission field, out to go minister in, let's say, Africa, to go off to China, to go and be missionaries, go to the Middle East or Europe or wherever it may be. But it could also very well be that God is putting on your heart saying, you know, I still love Uganda. I still desire to be to see people saved. Right? And so because of this, we find that the Lord's response to us then, if we're not called to go, would be do what we can to help those who are. Right? To prepare them, to give them funds, to give them supplies, to help them in any way that we can, so that when they go off to go do that ministry, they'll be ready for it. Now, Solomon goes to Hiram and he essentially says, hey, I need lumber and I need you to send men to help us get these boards ready, because your men are much more skilled at this than my men are. So he goes and he's going to send men up there to help them in this. But at the end of the day, he says, if you do this for me, I will send you whatever wages you need. And we find then in verses 7 through 12, Hiram responds. And he says, so it was when Hiram heard the words of Solomon that he rejoiced greatly and said, blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son over this great people. Then Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I have considered the message which you sent me, and I will do all you desire concerning the cedar and cypress logs. My servant shall bring them down from Lebanon to the sea, and I will float them in rafts by the sea to the place you indicate to me, and will have them broken apart there, and then you can take them away, and you shall fulfill my desire by giving food for my household." Then Hiram gave Solomon cedar and cypress logs according to all his desire, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, and 20 cores of pressed oil. Then thus Solomon gave to Hiram year by year. So the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he had promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty together. Now Hiram agrees to help. And essentially the way that he's going to send the logs down is because Tyre was a port city, what they would do is they would get all the logs ready and they would essentially float them down the Mediterranean. And then they would go and at the port city of Joppa and go and pick them up. They would get the wood prepared, and then they would carry the wood then the 35 miles from Joppa to Jerusalem to then have the lumber that was necessary for the temple. Now, in doing so, we find that the wage that Hiram requested was essentially, I want wheat and I need oil for my people, for my household. Now, while trees may have been in abundance up in the mountains and in the forests, that is not a good area for growing olives, right, for the oil. And that is not a good area for growing wheat. And so it would seem that essentially they are just trading supplies. They're giving him all the trees that he needs, all the lumber. And then in doing so, Solomon would say, and I'll give you all the wheat and I'll give you all the oil that you need. Now in doing this, we find that Hiram then makes a treaty with Solomon, and they continue to have this treaty, it would seem, really the rest of Hiram's life. Now, after getting all the lumber that was necessary, we then find that Solomon then begins to raise up a workforce in order to get the stone. So then Solomon raised up a labor force out of all Israel, and the labor force was 30,000 men. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They were 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home, and Adoniram was in charge of the labor force. And Solomon had 70,000 who carried burdens, and 80,000 who quarried stone in the mountains, besides 3,300 from the chiefs of Solomon's deputies who supervised the people who labored in work. And the king commanded them to quarry large stones, costly stones, and hewn stones to lay on the foundations of the temple. So Solomon's builders, Hiram's builders, and the Gebalites quarried them and prepared timber and stones to build the temple. Now Solomon prepared a group of 30,000 men to go up north to go and work in Lebanon. These were all Israelites, and these were, it would seem, would be, at least these guys were paid to do this job. And the way that it would work, the shift was you would go up there for a month, and then you would be back for 2 months. And so out of these 30,000 men, only really one of them was up there. Only one group of 10,000 was up there then at a time. But while these men may have been paid to do this job, there was the more grueling work of digging out all the rock that was going to be needed to be building the temple. And for these men to go and do this, we find that Solomon went and he raised up 150,000 men who were essentially indentured servants, or essentially slaves. Now these weren't Israelites. These instead were the Canaanite people who Israel had made a treaty with. And even though they were supposed to have been destroyed, they essentially made a treaty and said, hey, if you don't kill us, we'll be your servants forever. And so that's essentially who these people are that went and to dig out all of this stone and all of this rock for the temple. Now, this, of course, was grueling work, but at least it was still in the area, right? They were able to dig most of this rock out right outside of Jerusalem. In fact, if you go to Jerusalem even today, you'll be able to see this area called Solomon's Quarry, where they went and dug out most of the stone and the rock that was needed in order for them to build the temple. But in doing this, we find that now Solomon had all of the supplies that he needed for building the temple. And so now we're going to find that he's going to go and build it. And this is what we see in chapter 6. It says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the months of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. Now the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, its length was 60 cubits, its width 20, and its height was 30 cubits. The vestibule in front of the sanctuary in the house was 20 cubits along the width of the house. And the width of the vestibule extended 10 cubits from the front of the house. And he made for the house windows with beveled frames." Now, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, after 480 years of being out of Egypt, we find that the Lord is now getting a temple built for him. Now, we don't know exactly how long it took for them to quarry out all the stone. But we know it took at most 4 years, because now we see it is in the 4th year that this temple is built. And we are given the dimensions of it in verse 2. Now, it mentions that it's 60 cubits and 20 cubits and 30 cubits, but the reality is, as we hear that, we're going like, what's a cubit? Right, we have a hard enough time, I guess, with the metric system here in America, let alone hearing this a whole other measurement. But a cubit is essentially 18 inches, right? They say it was the spans from your finger to your elbow. And it was a standardized unit of measurement by this point. But because it was 18 inches, we find then that the temple was then about 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. These were double the dimensions of the tabernacle, and it would seem that Solomon's like, okay, if the tabernacle was this small, right, we need to create a greater temple for the Lord. Let's give him more space. And so he doubled all of the dimensions of the tabernacle. But you got to say, though, for a temple itself, it wasn't really super big. Right? Being 90 feet long and 30 feet wide and 45 feet tall, I've seen houses that were bigger than this. But what is interesting, though, is that it was not so much about the size as it was about the grandeur. And we're going to see in just a minute just how grand this temple was. But the temple was made up essentially of 3 different rooms. The first was the vestibule. And the vestibule is not necessarily a word we hear very often, but that was essentially a porch. And in fact, I think some translations actually translate the word vestibule as porch. But it was essentially the porch right outside of the entrance of the tabernacle. And the reason that was put there was it made it very clear where people could go, right? It was a clear dividing line, because unlike most churches, the temple couldn't just be entered by anybody. You couldn't just walk in there and worship. No, that was what the courtyards are for. And in fact, they even had layers of courtyards, right? There was one for Gentiles, then for women, then for men, then priests, and all of this. But the temple could only be entered by priests. And not just any priest. These priests had to be from the tribe of Levi. And so because of this, we find that they made this clear delineation here to ensure that nobody who wasn't a priest would enter in to the temple. Now, when you would walk in, the next room that you would get into was the place that was known as the holy place. Right? It is there that we find that there's the windows that are talked about here in verse 4. And these windows essentially were at the top of the temple, and they had like shades on them that they could be put down, and they were there mostly to provide light. But the reason they were placed at the top of the room was essentially to allow the place to have ventilation. Because, in there's also the altar of incense. In there's the candles. In there was all of that stuff. It would need to be brought out. Otherwise, people would start choking or whatever while being in there for many hours. There's the table of showbread in there as well. But in addition to these two rooms, and the priests were allowed to go in there, and it is there that they did most of the ceremonial stuff. But then finally, after these two rooms, we found there was the third one. And this was what was known as the Holy of Holies. Right? If the one place was the holy place, this is the Holy of Holies. Or as it's going to be called here, the most holy place. Or it's also called the throne room of God. Now it is in there that we find that the only piece of furniture that was in there, at least in the tabernacle, was the Ark of the Covenant. Now Solomon's also going to be adding 2 cherubim in there as well, as we're going to see. But the temple was essentially just these 3 rooms. Now, I think it's really interesting that we find, and while it's not mentioned here, we do find in 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1, that the hill that the temple was built on was Mount Moriah. Now, Mount Moriah, it plays a significant role all throughout biblical history, because we find Mount Moriah is the mountain in which Abraham went to go and sacrifice Isaac, right, which was a picture of what it is that the father was going to do for his son on our behalf. Right, it is there that we also found that David had to buy that threshing floor in order to bring forgiveness and everything, and offered sacrifices there. And the most significant of this, other than the fact that the temple was built there, is a little bit further down on the mountain and there on Mount Moriah. This would be the place that Jesus would die for each and every one of us. Right, this mountain is significant. Now, we find that in going through there, I lost my place for a second. In addition to that, we find also in verses 4 through 28, we are then given, 4 through 14, we're then given a description as to what the chambers look like. It says, against the walls of the temple, he built the chambers all around, against the walls of the temple, all around the sanctuary and the inner sanctuary. Thus he made the side chambers all around. The lower chamber was 5 cubits wide, and the middle was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide, for he made narrow ledges along the outside of the temple, so that the support beams would not be fastened onto the walls of the temple. And the temple, when it was built, it was finished being built with stone and finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. And the doorway of the middle story was on the right side of the temple, and they went up by the stairs to the middle story, and from the middle to the third. So he built the temple and finished it, and paneled the temple with beams and boards of cedar. And he built the side chambers against the entire temple, each 5 cubits high, and they were attached to the temple with cedar beams. Actually, we'll stop there for a second. Now, in addition to having these 2 rooms, Solomon added something to it. We find that along the sides of the temple, he added storerooms. Now, these rooms would be used essentially for building up, putting supplies in. They would be used, if necessary, for priests to have a place to go to rest after all the long duties that were done. But the text makes it, emphasizes all the more, and makes it clear that while Solomon built these storage rooms in there, and while they were good to be in the place, they weren't actually part of the tabernacle. The way that he built it was that they basically came up against it, and then thus they were held up, but they weren't actually part of the tabernacle itself, and the temple itself. And it would seem that the reason that Solomon, the author is wanting to emphasize this, was simply because he didn't want them to think that Solomon added to the model that God had created for him. Now, these rooms had access on the right side. The way you would get in is essentially there was a spiral staircase that you would go up, and then that gave you access to the second floor or second tier, as well as the third tier of the rooms. Now, after building these things, we find that Solomon was almost finished with everything that he was building. And it is around this time that we find in verse 11 that God begins to speak to Solomon about this. It says, "Then the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this temple which you are building, if you walk in my statutes, execute my judgments, keep all my commandments, and walk in them, then I will perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father David. And I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel." So Solomon built the temple, and he finished it. Now, after going and completing the temple, we find that Solomon then went, the Lord then appeared to him and basically gave him a twofold message. Now, the first message, we find it was really something that was repeated. We saw it already in chapter 1, chapter 2. It was a message from David to Solomon. We also saw it in chapter 3 when the Lord was speaking to Solomon. And that was essentially this, saying, you need to continue in my statutes. Continue in what it is I'm doing. And what it is you're doing. Continue to follow me. Now, this was, I think, an important reminder to Solomon at this point, because as he is now getting close to finishing the temple, there can be the tendency for him to think, okay, well, I did the Lord's work, I'm done. I find that there is the tendency, I think, within each and every one of us to, after we do some great things for the Lord, or do these great works for him, to begin to respond by saying, okay, well, I'm done with that. Now let me just sit back and relax. And we stop then pursuing him. We stop continuing in the Lord. And next thing you know, because of this, though we may have done some great things for him in the past, right, next thing you know, our lives and our walk with the Lord all begin to be defined by the thing that happened a while ago. You know, while I am really excited to hear about what it is what God did in your life 15, 20 years ago, and how God greatly used you then, and I'm even more excited to hear about how the Lord is using you now. Right, just because you have maybe done some awesome things for the Lord in the past, just because you've been able to minister to him in these ways in the past, that doesn't mean that you now can just stop. That doesn't mean that you're done. The Lord has more for you to do. He desires for you to continue to grow in him, continue to pursue him, continue to walk towards him. Because if we don't, what we're going to do is we're going to slowly but surely drift. You know, I've heard it said that, you know, a walk with the Lord is like walking up a down escalator. Right? As long as you're going and heading in the other direction, you can make some headway, but the moment you stop is the moment you begin to go backwards again. And Solomon is about to be doing the very thing that he was put on the earth to do, to build this temple. And because of this, right, the Lord here is warning him, saying, once you're finished with this, right, even though you're done with this work, that doesn't mean you're done. Right, there's still more to do. Right, there's still more to know about me. There's still more ways to grow. And that is the encouragement for each and every one of us as well. Right? We're not done yet. Right? Keep going. Keep pursuing. Yeah, you may have done some great things for the Lord, maybe even last week. But don't be content with what happened last week. Right? Pursue Him all the more and see what it is that the Lord is going to want to do for you next week. Wants to do in you tomorrow. Maybe even today. Now, the second thing in emphasizing this, we find in verse 13 when he says, "And I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel." Now, this is the same wording that the Lord used back in Exodus, I believe, chapter 29, to describe His relationship to the people when it came to the tabernacle. And so in using this wording, we find what God is doing is He is affirming to Solomon the fact that this temple is going to be a legitimate successor to the tabernacle. Right? He doesn't want Solomon to be sitting there going like, okay, was this me? Right? Did I do all this because this was something that I thought I should be doing? The Lord didn't want him to doubt that this was of Him. And so because of this, we find that the Lord gives him this word of encouragement as well. I'm going to dwell among the people and won't forsake them. Now, it should be noted that it says, I'm going to dwell among the people. This then implies that the temple itself wasn't going to hold all God in. Right? To assume that the God was nowhere but the temple would have been foolishness. Right? Folly. And so he's emphasizing I'm going to be among the people. But this was a good work. This was what Solomon should be doing. And the Lord is emphasizing that in this. Now, after emphasizing the fact that he built the rooms, he built all of these side chambers as well, we find then that Solomon begins to work on the inside. And we see this starting in verse 15, where we read, "And he built the inside walls of the temple with cedar boards from the floor of the temple to the ceiling, which he paneled the inside with wood. And he covered the floor of the temple with planks of cypress. Then he built the 20-cubit room at the rear of the temple from the floor to the ceiling with cedar boards. And he built it inside as the inner sanctuary, as the most holy place. And in the front of the temple sanctuary was 40 cubits long. And the inside of the temple was cedar, carved with ornamental buds and open floors, as was cedar, and there was no stone to be seen." Now in this we read that on the inside of the temple, the Lord covered the entire thing with cedar. He didn't want any of the outside stone to be visible, but instead we find he puts boards over everything. And as he did, he then also put bud and flower reliefs all over the wood that it was covering the temple, essentially as a way to decorate it all the more. He wanted the temple not just to be just this cold stone place, but the wood would help the temple to feel much more warm and inviting when you come in. Now, we find then in verses 19 through 36, we're then given a description of how Solomon went and built the inner sanctuary, known, as we mentioned, as the Holy of Holies, or the holy place. And so in it we read, "And he prepared the inner sanctuary inside the temple, and set the Ark of the Covenant there. And the inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high. He overlaid it with pure gold, and overlaid the altar of cedar. So Solomon overlaid the inside of the temple with pure gold, and he stretched gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary, and overlaid it with gold. The whole temple he overlaid with gold, until he had finished all the temple. Also, he overlaid with gold the entire altar that was by the inner sanctuary. Now, inside the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. One wing of the cherub was 5 cubits, and the other wing of the cherub was 5 cubits, 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. And the other cherub was 10 cubits. Both cherubim were the same size and shape. The height of one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was the other cherub. Then he set the cherubim inside the inner room, and he stretched out the wings of the cherubim so that the wing of one touched one wall, and the wing of the other touched the other wall, and their wings touched each other in the middle of the room. So he overlaid the cherubim with gold. Then he carved all the walls of the temple all around, both the inner and outer sanctuaries, with carved figurines of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. And the floor of the temple was overlaid with gold, both the inner and outer sanctuaries. For the entrance of the inner sanctuary, he made doors of olive wood. The lintel and the doorposts were 1/5 of the wall. The 2 doors were of olive wood, and he carved on them figures of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and overlaid them with gold. And he spread out the gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees. So for the door of the sanctuary, he also made doorposts of olive wood, 1/4 of the wall. And on the 2 doors of cypress wood, 2 panels comprising one folding door, and 2 panels comprising the other folding door. Then he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers on them, and overlaid them with gold applied evenly in the carved work. So he built the inner court with the 3 rows of hewn stone and the row of cedar beams. Now that was a lot of information. But essentially what we see in this is that Solomon began working now on the Holy of Holies. Now the Holy of Holies was essentially a cube room. It was 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet. And in it, Solomon went and he placed he made 2 large statues of cherubim. Now cherubim are essentially angels who we find surround the throne room of the Lord. And he built these angels in such a way as that as their wings were spread out, one wing would be touching one wall, and then the other wing would be touching the other cherubim's wing, and then the other one would then be touching the other wall. So they were spread out over the entire room, the Holy of Holies. Now, in between the 2 angels and their wings, we find that this is where the Ark of the Covenant was to be placed. Now, the reason that Solomon placed these cherubim in there was because these angels were majestic, but they were also known for guarding God's presence. And so, in putting them in there, we find that Solomon is trying to emphasize, especially since these cherubim were facing the entrance to the Holy of Holies. Right? He is emphasizing all the more just how serious it is for those who are going to be coming in. Now, granted, only one man was allowed to come into the Holy of Holies once a year, which was the high priest. And this was only done after he had made all kinds of sacrifices and purified himself to ensure that there was no sin in his life. But these cherubim would be standing there, basically in some ways glaring at him as a reminder of just how big a deal it is for him to be in here in the first place. Now, all of this was overlaid with gold. And it was basically beaten in until it was flat and a nice sheen over the whole thing. And not only was the cherubim and the walls and all of this with gold, but also in the holy place, all of it was covered in gold as well. Now, Solomon also put more reliefs on the walls, including other cherubim, including open flowers and palm trees and all of this. And the reason he did so was just all the more to make it look majestic, or to just show just how grand and opulent, right, his great and mighty God was. Now, the holy place was given doors, and these two doors, which seemed, I guess, to stay open most of the time, they were basically folding doors that could open and close. And they were also given the same design on the doors. But what is interesting is, in addition to having doors there, the holy place, we also find that there was a veil put in front of it. And in addition to that, on there was also golden chains that were placed over it. Solomon, and really the Lord, in having the veil there in the first place, was emphasizing all the more the fact that the holy place was inaccessible. It was not a place that you could just go into willy-nilly. You can just walk on in, okay, yeah, I want to hang out with Jesus now, let me go in there kind of thing. No, that wasn't like that. To go into there would mean to die. It was a big deal. And the emphasis we see in this over and over again was simply the fact that you can't get to God on your own. You can't just go in there yourself. You know, there are a lot of people who have the mentality of going, well, I'm going to go to God and give him a piece of my mind. No, you are not. All right, our God is holy. Our God is great. You can't just come into his presence alone because you are not holy. You are in and of yourself. You are not great. You're not righteous. You're a sinner. And so because of this, the veil was put there, the door was put there, these chains were put there to emphasize the fact that we can't come into his presence ourselves. Now, this is all the more, this is what makes the idea of the fact that the veil being torn by the Lord all the more amazing. Remember when Jesus died on the cross and the veil was torn from top to bottom, saying that we now, because of what it is Jesus did for us, right, taking that penalty of our sin upon himself, that in doing so, he paid that penalty for us so that we can now be holy, we can now be righteous, and we can now come into his presence. Not because of what it is that we did, but because of what it is Jesus did for us. Now, in laying the gold and doing the cherubim, we find that now the temple is done. Now, in reading this, I will admit to you that I had a hard time envisioning what exactly this looked like. And so, I went online and actually I found, with permission from this is from ESV.com, but there is a picture right here showing what it is that the temple looked like. And you see in here, there's the gold walls. There's all the side rooms. There is the holy place. There is the Holy of Holies with the two cherubim and all of this. This is essentially a picture of what the temple looks like. And I've included this also on Facebook so that if you want to go and reference this again, this is a great resource for you to be able to use. So, when you have opportunity, go and take a look at this. But we find that in building all of these things, it took Solomon roughly 7.5 years to go and build the temple. Now, in contrast to building the Lord's house there in 7.5 years, we now see in verses 1 through 9 of chapter 7, a picture of Solomon's palace. And in it we read, but Solomon took 13 years to build his own house. So he finished all his house, and he also built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, its width was 50 cubits, and its height was 30 cubits, with the 4 rows of cedar pillars and cedar beams on the pillars. And it was paneled with cedar above the beams, which were of 55 pillars, 15 in a row. And there were windows with beveled frames in 3 rows. And window was opposite window in 3 tiers. And all the doorways and doorposts had rectangular frames, and the window was opposite the windows in the 3 tiers. And he made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, its width was 30 cubits, and in front of them was a portico with pillars, and a canopy was in front of them. Then he made the hall from the throne, a hall for the throne, the hall of judgment, where he might judge, and it was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling. And the house where he dwelt had another court inside the hall, like workmanship. And Solomon also made a house like the hall of Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as wife. And all these were of costly stone, cut to size, trimmed with saws inside and out, from the foundation of the eaves, and also the outside of the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, large stones, some 10 cubits, some 8 cubits. And above were costly stones, hewn to size, and cedar wood. And the great court was enclosed with 3 rows of hewn stones and a row of cedar beams. So were the inner court of the house of the Lord and the vestibule of the temple. Now, though it took Solomon 7.5 years to build the temple, we find that it took him 13 years to build his own house. Now, this is mentioned here almost as an aside to the building of the temple, because we're going to see that starting really in verse 13, it gets back into talking about the building of the furniture. But in emphasizing the fact that it took almost double the amount of time to build his own house, many suggest that what this points to was the fact that as Solomon grew and as things progressed, right, his priorities for the Lord waned. Now, some argue that the reason it took Solomon so long was simply the fact that while David had spent 20 years of his life gathering supplies and he had made the plans and all of that, Solomon had to basically come up with all of this on his own, so that could have taken him more time. And there's probably some validity to that. But I think that the reason that the author not only emphasizes the fact that it took 13 years after immediately mentioning that it was 7.5 years to build the temple, and also emphasizing the fact that this house was grand, right, that it was larger. In fact, the description given here that his palace was actually twice the size that the temple was. Right? And emphasizing all of these things, it would seem that the point that is being made is the fact that Solomon wanted his place to not just be as good as the temple, but he wanted it to be better. I think it's interesting. The palace was actually called the Forest of Lebanon. And this wasn't because it was in Lebanon, but it was because that it took so many beams, it took so many trees from Lebanon that it almost had an entire forest in there of trees. Right, his place was grand. It was massive. And what this shows in Solomon's heart, though it doesn't implicitly say it here, was that Solomon's heart, after building this temple, slowly but surely began to drift away from the Lord. And this is really the beginning of what's going to be a major issue we find starting in chapter 10, as he is going to, in chapters 10 and then in 11, completely turn his heart from God. But in emphasizing this here, especially because this is actually outside of the narrative. The narrative has been all about building the temple, and then we talk, and 13 years after he does all this, his palace is going to be made. The author wants to emphasize this as a comparison to that of the temple, and show that though Solomon put a lot of work and put a lot of effort and a lot of thought into building the temple, right, it seemed like he put even more into his own house. Now, after mentioning this, starting in verse 13, we now are introduced to this guy Huram of Tyre. And we read, Now King Solomon sent and brought Huram from Tyre. And he was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali. And his father was a man of Tyre, a bronze worker. And he was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill in working with all kinds of bronze work. So he came to King Solomon and did all the work. Now here we're introduced to this guy Huram. Now in the Hebrew, his name is actually the same as Hiram, which was the king of Tyre. It would seem that many of the translators made his name be Huram, if for no other reason than we wouldn't be confused and wouldn't say, hey, the king is also a really good bronze worker? Right? He did. I guess the translators didn't want us to get confused in this, but at the end of the day, we find that this guy Huram was also from Tyre, or at least his dad was. But his mom was from the Hebrew tribe of Naphtali. Now, his dad apparently had passed away a while ago, and we find in Chronicles that he and his mother at this point were living in the land of the tribe of Dan. But he, we find, was a gifted bronze worker. All right, verse 14 tells us that he was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill in working with all kinds of bronze work. Now, I'm not very artistic. I draw a picture and people are like, oh, did your 2-year-old draw that? I'm like, yeah, it was Izzy. I'm not very good at that kind of thing. But I do think, though, that there is a place for arts, right? I find that, often because many people in leadership in church aren't necessarily creative in an artistic way, right? That can kind of be downplayed or even looked as if it was something that was wrong. But the reality is, being artistic and being able to create in that way, that in and of itself is a gift. Right? It is not something that should be downplayed. I think it is really cool here that Solomon recognized the fact that he may have been okay with bronze. We have no idea. But he knew that there was somebody that was better. And somebody who was more skilled in this way. And so he goes and finds somebody who the Lord had specifically gifted in being able to do this work in order to prepare the temple. Right? I don't know if you have artistic ability, whether it be, in writing, whether it be in, building or sculpting or painting or whatever it may be. But know this, the ability that you have was given to you by God. And so the question, I guess, that you need to be asking yourself is not, why aren't I being represented more in the church? The question you need to be asking yourself is, what can I do to glorify God with this gift that he has given me? Yeah, yes, there is a place, I think, for representation. And sometimes I think the church get this wrong in discouraging the arts. But, if you've been given this gift, right, glorify him with it. Hiram does. And we see him building. In fact, we find he builds many things with bronze. In verses 15 through 22, we find that he goes, and the first thing he builds is 2 pillars. Now, if you go back to the picture that we had seen earlier, notice at the very front of the temple, we see these 2 large bronze pillars. Now, they were roughly about 27 feet tall, 18 feet around, and they were ornately decorated with a network of wreaths, of chain work, and with pomegranates. And they had caps on the top of them. It's called capitals here in this text that were 7.5 feet tall, and they were in the shape of a lily. Now, these things were extravagant. And they, in fact, so much so that we find that they were each given a name. The first name, the name of the first pillar was Jachin, which means he shall establish. And the other one's name was Boaz, which means in it is strength. Now, there is much speculation as to what exactly these pillars mean. In fact, the Freemasons have used this to create all kinds of heresy with these two pillars. But some suggest that what these two pillars are talking about in saying that he shall establish and in it is strength, some say that this is in reference to the house of David. Right, that it is God who established the house of David, and it is God who is going to give him and his descendants strength. I mean, perhaps. Others suggest that this is a reference to the nation of Israel, that saying that, God established Israel, and God is going to be giving it strength. And this may be true too. The one that I lean more towards is that it was a reference to God's sovereignty and his power. See, in Scripture, we find that bronze is often a picture of judgment. Right? And this is why we see when there's the altar of bronze, that it is these animals that have to be killed because of our sin. Right? We're going to see this brass sea, which was a large basin. And it emphasizes the fact that we are filthy before the Lord and that we need to be cleaned and all of this. Over and over again, we see that brass is a picture of judgment. And so it would seem then that as these priests were walking into the temple, right, that these two pillars were placed there almost as a reminder to them, saying that the God that they serve was sovereign, right? That he is the one that establishes, and that he is the one who is powerful, that he is strong. Right? He is strong, he is powerful, and that he's holy. Right? It was a reminder then again for the priests as they were walking in of the seriousness of what it is that they were doing. Right? They shouldn't just be coming in to the temple like, okay, yeah, let's go put the bread in. Okay, that kind of thing. But instead, right, they needed to do it with seriousness, with the understanding as to who it is that God is. Now, in addition to these pillars, we also see that Huram also built a bronze sea. Now, as I mentioned, this bronze sea was essentially a big basin that carried, we find here that it stored 2,000 baths, which is roughly 12,000 gallons of water. Right? It was 15 feet tall, and the water was used to help clean the priests. It was used to help clean the sacrifices and the various tools and all of that as well. It was huge. Now, in verse 25, we find that holding this huge basin up was these 12 bronze oxen. Now, 3 we find were looking to the north, 3 were looking south, 3 were looking east, and 3 were looking west. Here's a picture of what they look like right here. Now, these 12 oxen is believed to be a picture of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the reason it is believed this is because when they went and traveled throughout the wilderness, we find that when they camped, 3 were in the west, 3 were in the north, 3 were in the east, and 3 were in the south. And so because of this, it is a constant then reminder as looking at these 12 oxen, that, the judgment and everything of the Lord was upon them. And so because of this, we need to be in constant awareness of what it is that we are doing and who it is that we are ministering for to the priests. Now, as you can imagine, these basins were probably, this huge basin was going to be quite difficult to get water out of consistently. And so we find that in addition to having this big bronze basin that held all the water, we find also in verses 27 to 39, Huram then goes and makes carts with the lavers in them that were essentially big bowls so that they could wheel them around and make them, and to transport them easy. They look similar to what we find here in this picture. Now, each of these were made so that as water needed to be brought around to clean themselves, right, after making these sacrifices, to do the various ceremonial cleansings for themselves, or as they needed to go and wash the sacrifices, or the tools that were used to cut these animals up for the burnt offerings and all of them. People needed access. They needed the access quick. And so putting them on these carts allowed them to be able to get around quickly. Now with this, we find that Huram then was able to then build out of bronze all of these great works. In addition to this, we find that he also made pots, he made shovels, he made bowls, and various different articles there for the house of the Lord as well. He used his gift in order to worship the Lord and prepare for him in this way. And so then we find in verse 48, we get Solomon going and putting the last bits of furniture into the temple, other than, of course, the ark, which we're going to see him put in next week. But it says, thus Solomon had all the furnishings made for the house of the Lord, the altar of gold, the table of gold, which was the showbread, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the right side and 5 on the left, in front of the inner sanctuary, with flowers and lamps with wick trimmers of gold. The basins, the trimmers, the bowls, the ladles, the censers of pure gold, the hinges of gold, both for the doors of the inner room, the most holy place, and for the doors of the main hall of the temple. So all the work that the King Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought all the things which his father had dedicated, the silver and the gold and the furnishings, and he put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. Now Solomon now goes and he puts all of the last things that needed to be put into the temple, whether it be the table of showbread, whether it be the various candles, the altar of incense, all of this. And at this point, we find now the temple is completely ready. It is ready to now go and be dedicated. And we're going to look at the dedication of the temple next week when we get to chapter 8. But as we read through all of this, right, and we look at the great detail that is put into describing each of the things that were built, the question can so easily come to us as we read this both here in chapters 5 through 7, but also then read it later again in 2 Chronicles chapters 2 through 4. The question then becomes, well, why? Why is so much detail given? Why doesn't it just say, and he built the temple? Well, the reason for this, I believe, is really threefold. The point that we are supposed to understand, and the first thing is, the Lord wants us to see just how ornate and great this temple was. Now, and the reason I think that this needs to be emphasized is simply because the writer and Solomon and the Lord wants us to understand that he's worth it. You know, it can be so easy for us at times to forget who it is that we are worshiping. Right? To forget just how great and powerful and mighty and majestic, right, our God is. Right? We can so easily just relegate him to, oh, he's that friend, he's the guy I turn to when I'm in trouble, kind of thing, and that's about it. But the reality is, the God that we serve, right, he is holy. Right? He is great. Solomon understood this. And so because of this, we find in 2 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 5, we read, as he's talking to Hiram, he says, the temple which I build will be great, for our God is greater than all gods. Why do we praise him? Right? Why do we serve him? Why did he bother building this temple? It's because he's worth it. Right? I pray that as you continue to grow in your understanding of who the Lord is, that he will begin to show you just how great he is. And that in turn, that this would cause us to desire to serve him more. to love him more, to praise and worship him more, not out of obligation, not out of duty, but simply because we understand he's worth it. Now, the second thing that we see in looking at this building of the temple, it's that if we are called to do something, and Solomon was called to build this temple here, then we need to do it to the best of our ability. Right? Solomon didn't just slap a couple of rocks together and said, okay, yeah, this is it, this is the temple, this is great. No, he knew who his God was, and so because of this, he wanted to do this work for him. Right? Anything worth doing, especially for the Lord, is worth doing well. Right? And the same can be said of us. What is it that God is calling you to do? What is it that he's been speaking to your heart? Right? Don't just wing it. Right? Don't just be like, okay, well, I'll do it just a little bit. No. If God has called you to something, then you need to seek to do it to the best of your ability. Because, as I mentioned, he's worth it. Now, the third thing we see in here, which I think is really awesome, is just in the fact that David had gone ahead and done all this work beforehand for Solomon to be able to be ready to do this great work for the Lord. Right? And to me, that this is a great picture of what exactly the Lord does for us. Right? As we go out to do this thing for him, we find that he has already gone ahead to prepare that work for us. We find in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 10, we read, "For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." Right? Is God calling you to something? Is God calling you to a work? The great news is that this isn't something that you're going to have to then try to figure out and to work out and to plan and prepare, and hopefully you'll be able to get it done. No. Right? If God has called you to it, then he is already actively at work, preparing that work so that when we go to do it, right, it will be done effectively. Right? So we do it for him to the best of our ability, but then we trust him to take the rest and to use it for his glory. Now, I think it's interesting, in Haggai chapter 2, we find that after this temple, the Solomon's temple, is torn down, and the people then go back in Haggai and go and rebuild the temple and everything, those who remember what the first temple, the Solomon's temple, looked like, right, they respond by weeping. They're like, oh, this place is terrible compared to what Solomon had. This place is no good in all of this. And the Lord's response essentially to the people who are saying this is, hey, stop that. Knock it off. He was, I'm glorified in this temple just as I was glorified in the other one. Right? So we don't need to then, the point in that we see is that we don't need to be comparing our work or our deeds or our actions to other people's work. We just need to be doing what God has called us to. So if he is calling you to do a work, don't try to be doing it just like everybody else did. Do it the way that he has called you to do. And we're going to find that he will be glorified in it. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for the fact that you have given us each a work to do. But in addition to that you have given us a work that you are preparing in advance for us to be doing. I ask, Father, that you would help us to understand and to see just how magnificent, how holy, how great you are. And in turn, Lord, that our response to you would be to glorify and to walk closer to you because of it. I thank you for your love. I thank you for just how amazing you are. Continue to do that work in us. Continue to grow us in our understanding of who you are. And in turn, God, help us to desire to do the work for you to the best of our ability. We lift these things up to you and we pray them in Jesus' name. Amen.